Welcome to this episode of Timotheus Academy. This episode is part one of a multi-part Timotheus Academy episode, featuring some of the elements of a discussion I had. It is my hope that this episode brings great value to you. Well, it's wonderful to be with you here today at Timotheus Academy. We've got a treat today in that we have Dr. J.T. Bridges, a scholar in many fields, a former classmate of mine, a colleague of mine, and he is here to share lots of wisdom with us today, with me, with you, with all of us. And I know it's just going to be a time of great benefit, and I know he's going to bring a lot of value to you here as you listen and view this course material. We are privileged to have him, and we're so excited to hear what he has to say. And he actually has a new book out, and we are going to be talking about that and the topics that surround or are included in that book. So welcome to Timotheus Academy, Dr. Bridges, and it's so good to have you here with us here today. And
Dr. Brown, thanks for having me on.
Thank you, brother. And maybe if you could just give us a word or two just about your book, just to frame this discussion, and then we'll launch into maybe some topics regarding that.
Sure. Yeah, the title of the book is Beyond Origin. That is a reference to Darwin's Origin of Species. So Beyond Origin, and the subtitle is a post-Darwinian design theory. So there's a lot going on just in the title. The book is actually a product of my dissertation research that I did at Southern Evangelical while we were both there, and the impetus was during the gap between finishing at Baylor and starting at SES, I revisited the neo-Darwinism intelligent design issue, and I spent about 2 years or so reading through the Darwinists themselves, people like Niles Eldredge, Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Dawkins, Eugenie Scott, a plethora of pro-Darwinist thinkers, pro-ID material from the ID literature, and then controversial, in the early 2000s, 2010 or so, there was a very lively debate in the culture and between these two camps of the conservative evolutionary biologists and pro-evolutionists, and then the anti-evolutionist and pro-intelligent design community on the other side. So I was reading through back and forth through those materials. While I was at Baylor, I really developed an interest in the history and philosophy of science. And so as I was reading back and forth through these different camps, I thought, there's something off. There's something, sort of two ships passing in the night, sort of missing each other. And so I realized that in order to referee this debate between neo-Darwinism and intelligent design, there are really two different kinds of science and two different scientific paradigms. And so in order to do that, you have to sort of go up a level of an abstraction from the sciences themselves to a philosophy of science. Okay. And then as I started getting into the philosophies of science, all these different perspectives on the philosophy of science, I realized that some of their fundamental disagreements were epistemological, that is, rooted in a deeper, more fundamental theory of knowledge. And so I went all the way back up to another level of abstraction, to the level of just epistemology itself. What is human knowing? And then tried to descend back, then having answered those sorts of levels of questions, descended back into the debate and tried to use materials from epistemology and the philosophy of science to clarify and perhaps even resolve some fairly intransigent aspects of that debate. So that's sort of the origin and summary content of the book.
Right. Yeah. Thanks so much for doing that. I remember when you did your defense there at SES, we were there in the basement, and there was it was either several tables or one large table put together, and kind of an all-star defense team. Can you let our listeners know some of the names of the gentlemen that were on your defense team there?
Yeah, so I did this strategically. One of our friends, Eric, was in charge of inviting scholars into our national conference that's usually held in the fall. And I said, I want you to invite John Lennox, Jay Richards, and William Dembski to the conference. And he said, okay, well, why? I said, because I plan on asking them to be on my dissertation committee
Right.
and writing my dissertation this summer. And if they're coming into town for the conference,
Mhm.
they'd be a whole lot like more likely to agree to be on
Right.
my committee. So I had strategized that for about 10 months. And so sure enough, because they were already in town for the conference, John Lennox, William Dembski, and Jay Richards, along
Wow.
with our own Richard Howe,
Well,
were made at my committee. And then in the sitting in the wings were like Fuzz Rana and Hugh Ross. So kind of a who's who in scientific
and I was
apologetics.
there,
Yeah, 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 and the future Dr. Brown.
and this nobody.
Yeah.
We'll edit that out.
Whenever
Okay.
I show Richard Howe the picture of that we took after the
He
defense,
did it. Yeah.
he'll say, "Which one of these is not like the
Mm,
others?" You know. But
mm,
but I will say this that among the four committee members
right.
were seven PhDs.
Right.
Uh, I think Lennox has three
Yeah.
doctorates, one in mathematics, one in the history and philosophy of science. William Dembski has a PhD in math and he had a PhD in philosophy. Jay finished his degree in, I think, philosophical theology at Princeton.
Well.
So, and one of Dembski's degrees is from University of Chicago. So,
Well. Okay.
John was from Oxford.
Wow. Wow. And so, I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of information. I mean, before we really launch into the book, because the book is rather scholarly, and I think it's written. I mean, some things just defy an incredible amount of reduction, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
yeah,
And I guess the book, and you could have elected to have reduced it to a more approachable level, and then it would have been like 7,000 pages. It's almost like a history of science and philosophy all wrapped up into one.
yeah,
And there is a presumption, correct me if I'm wrong again, that some of these concepts are already held, maybe by the one reading it. And I'm sure a lot of people who are listening or watching this will go ahead and check out your book, and we'll go to the Amazon link, and we're going to provide uh, a link for that so they can go and they can find it and they can obtain it. But just kind of as a primer for them, or maybe someone who's interested in um, this topic, yeah, maybe just some very basic discussion questions, really, underhanded pitches under the plate for you, and you have a tennis racket. It's like a beach ball being tossed at you, and you have a tennis racket. I know,
sure.
but just this
After finishing our
question,
doctorates, we're now back at recess.
just this question. What is science? And I think, it, I mean, we could probably just talk for an hour on that. We have this scientism today.
Hmm.
Um, Kind of had an apex with the new atheist. It seems like there's uh, from some corners a lot of pushback on that. But when we're talking about philosophy of science, um, what is science in your understanding?
Yeah, so we can start there, and then we can talk about maybe a little bit of the uh, approaches in the philosophy of science.
Right, right, right.
So science, the word itself comes from, as you know, scientia.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and for somebody like Aristotle, so going all the way back to the ancients, for somebody like Aristotle, what a science was. So Aristotle thought of, say, metaphysics as a science, not metaphysics in terms of like New Age esotericism, but metaphysics in terms of the study of being. It's just an understanding of something through its causes. So, for example, the ancient world knew that water froze when it got cold, right? But they didn't know that pure water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius, and we can raise and lower that based on atmospheric
Mm.
pressure or solvents or solutions like adding salt, right? So they understood what water was basically, and they understood that it froze when it got too cold, but they didn't have any sort of precision about the causes that change water from say a liquid state to a solid state, something like that.
Right,
Which means they had a basic sort of philosophy of nature, or they had a basic understanding of nature, but it wasn't scientific because it wasn't an understanding through what causes water to freeze
right.
at 32 degrees or something like that. So So science, in its broadest sort of conceptual sweep, is just an understanding of phenomenon or data via its causes. Now, one of the things that's a bit of a pet peeve of mine
Mhm.
is using the term science as a generic.
Right.
There's science and then there's non-science. First of all, this raises what in the literature is called the demarcation question.
Mm.
What is science versus non-science? And the reason that's it's not problematic for people doing science because science is very much bound by its methodologies, but it's similar to so science as a term, art, culture, religion, right? These are terms that are sort of amorphous and hard to pin down with a single sort of necessary and sufficient definition.
Mhm.
Science is similar to those. But my preferred term or phrase is the sciences
Right.
because it really flags the fact that um, marine biology is a science and botany is a science, right? But ecology is a science, but so is quantum mechanics and astrophysics and cosmology. And you go, well, the methods and approaches of quantum mechanists is very, very different than, say, an animal psychologist or a botanist, right? Now we recognize sort of qualitatively that they're distinct, and the question is, what exactly are those distinctions? And
Right.
um, so, so starting there, that the natural sciences study different objects with different methodological tools, all with this sort of backdrop of a broad assumption that sort of unifies the sciences, and that would be methodological naturalism. That is, the methods that the scientists employ are not, they're going to ignore potential spiritual realities like angels, demons, and God, right? And they're going to look for natural causes to explain natural effects, right? Um, I've sort of tested my students on this over the years
Right.
because being well versed in the intelligent design literature, I asked them, is it proper to invoke supernatural causes as part of our scientific methodology? And with an eye toward defending intelligent design, they will, at least probably 80 or 90% of them will say, yes, it's proper to invoke supernatural or non-natural causes as part of our method of doing science. And so I'll come back with this thought experiment. Okay, say there's a scientist who he sets up his experiment, he leaves the lab, he runs the experiment over the weekend, he comes back, and his claim is, I have developed a cure for cancer, but I can't get my data to work out because uh, the devil and demons keep corrupting my experiments.
Right.
And if it weren't for those demonic corrupting influences, this data will work out. But I assure you that this is the cure for cancer. You go, well, that sounds ridiculous. It should,
Right.
because we don't invoke non-natural causes in order to do to follow the methods of natural science. Now, you raise the term scientism as
Right.
part and parcel of some of the new atheism that was around largely in the early 2000s. And that's an important point. And I think some Christians think that if we allow a methodological atheist foot in the door, as it were, if we allow for the claim that natural scientists should not invoke supernatural causation when they're doing science, it just it just opens the door for this rampant atheism. And my attitude is no, because scientists doing science is not the same thing as scientists talking about the nature of science. J.P. Moreland has a famous point that he makes. I think in the book Naturalism that he and William Lane Craig co-edited. He says, anytime you're talking about the nature of science, you're not doing science, you're doing philosophy,
Right.
right? And so uh, for someone who's philosophically informed, allowing scientists a method for their science that is appropriate to their endeavor. That's not offensive or somehow disconcerting to me, because I think that's good and right and orderly, right? It's when scientists start proclaiming that the methods of science are the methods of studying reality in general. And this is the point that a guy named French philosopher Etienne Gilson makes in his book From Aristotle to Darwin and Back Again, specifically in the context of the notion of final causality. He says, um, if scientists want to ignore final causality, teleology, right? If scientists want to ignore teleology because they're doing science, that's fine. But if they say that they can ignore teleology altogether, well, that's not a scientific claim at all, right? That's a metaphysical claim about nature in general. So, so yeah, that's sort of the approach of the natural sciences. Um,
If I
and
could
then in
follow
the
up real quick,
yeah, go ahead.
just because I think I know where you're going. I might be wrong, but um, before we lose that point, um, just for those who are listening, who might not understand, the thin slice of what you're maybe describing here.
Mhm.
I don't understand that you're saying the divine being or God is not the cause of creation or something like that.
Yeah.
I understand that what you're saying is uh, almost kind of a God of the gaps kind of a description is that the way that God has made his creation is studyable and predictable through causes that it's not as if God supernaturally intervenes at every moment to cause everything to
R-
occur, if that makes
Right.
sense. And so
Yeah.
so we if we might this is almost a rather poor example, so I'll use it anyway. I know that makes sense. If we drop the hammer and we see it fall to the ground, we don't have to say that there's been a supernatural activity overriding the laws of nature uh, to draw that hammer toward the ground, if that makes sense. We understand that gravity is what's pulling pulling that down, or what objects. Again, but it gets into. I would love to have hours to talk to you about this. Because that's not what Aristotle thought, right? Aristotle thought it was somehow in the nature of an object to seek the lowest point.
Right. Yeah.
And then Steve Meyer's been doing some work on Newton. I think he did some Newtonian work at Cambridge when he was there, and just I've had the privilege of being able to apprehend some of that. Uh, Newton, and this is a whole different discussion, but rejected the scholastic and the classical categories. These were called in his days occult properties, and they
Hmm.
were trying to get these occult properties. For those listening, this isn't the occult. That's not what we're talking about.
They just mean
Uh,
unseen or
right,
mysterious.
right.
Yeah.
And so these occult properties, and Newton had back and forth discussions with other scientists about gravity. There's again this whole discussion about Immanuel Kant and interacting with Hume, and then Newton's scientific work about the same time. And we have this question with uh, Newton about what is gravity. Is he introducing occult properties back into science? Fundamentally, my understanding is Newton didn't have necessarily an answer for gravity, and so he did understand that at the core of this law was some sort of divine action, whether the result of creation
Mhm.
or something like that, if that makes sense. It's it, again, Meyer, that there's this kind of back and forth with that. What is gravity? The tendency for objects to seek the lowest point. And what is the tendency for objects to seek the lowest point? It's gravity. It's just kind of, there is some mystery
Yeah.
underlying reality. Um, but I know you as an existential Thomist, you would affirm without reservation that things do not have existential inertia. I know Ed Feser talks about that. That
Yeah.
ultimately God, as the scripture says, Christ upholds the worlds by the word of his power, right?
Yeah.
And so you're not denying, and I don't think you are, but just for our listeners, you're not denying ultimately God is holding the worlds in his hands. I think what you're describing here is that we can't go about science if the answer to every question of why just is immediate supernatural intervention. Is that
Right.
fair?
Yeah. Yes. Probably the easiest way to because you covered some fairly wide-ranging ideas there. I was like, I cannot trace everything that Dr. Brown is saying, or we'll
Just
never get back to the
blew up
phone.
the whole
Yeah.
discussion.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
4 days
Right.
later, our
Yeah.
beards
Yeah. Yeah. Beards, unshaven, 15th
just
cup of
time lapse
coffee.
in the beard.
So now that we're up to Kant, yeah, no.
Wait a minute, are we?
Probably the easiest way to slice the orange, as it were, is to say this. What we don't want to affirm is a kind of occasionalism.
Right, right, right.
Occasionalism means that there's only one cause of everything that happens, and that's God. So the hammer falling, water freezing, my kid getting sick, me getting married, not getting the job, um, burning the pizza, being late to the interview, like all of those things ultimately only have one cause. All effects only have one cause, and that's God.
No intermediate causes,
That's
just
right.
merely an ultimate cause, right?
That's right. So what we are saying is that God is the primary cause of all things. He holds all things into
Right.
existence every moment of their being. But when God creates, he creates things with, as Aquinas says, he gives things the dignity of secondary causality. That is, um, rabbits act like rabbits, and giraffes act like giraffes, and hippos act like hippos. Um, why? Ultimately, because God made them to be rabbits and giraffes and hippos. But having made them in that way, he gives them the dignity of then
Mm,
acting according to the species that he's given them.
right.
And so we have an indication of this in Genesis after the flood when it says that God, um, there's summer and winter, seed time and harvest. There is this regularity to the natural
Right.
world that is not self-sustaining. The reason it has those regularities and this inherent intelligibility and why the human has a mind that can read those things off are all require God as the
Right.
best explanation. But I'll say this.
Right.
C.S. Lewis makes the point in his book on the problem of evil. It's not a grief observed, it's a problem of suffering, maybe, um, where he talks about the importance of human beings making a decision about things. Basically, the only way that we can make right decisions is in a stable natural environment. Because uh, if I give you a donut, I have to know that donuts are just a sweet pastry.
Right.
They're perhaps not the most nutritionally dense breakfast, but I have to know that a donut, by and large, as just as a donut, is not poison to the human body. Now, somebody who's sort of anti-sugar may debate that,
Sugar
but
spoils.
yeah, exactly. So maybe some an apple. We'll change it to an apple.
Right, right.
So
Broccoli.
yeah, broccoli. Yeah. So how do I know whether or not broccoli,
Right,
whether or not I should eat broccoli in order to be a healthy human
right,
being? I have to be able to make decisions in a stable environment where broccoli, by and large, if it's not infected or tainted or somewhere, is healthy for the human being, as opposed to, well, donuts or the college staple of ramen noodles or something
Yeah,
like that.
right. Pop Tarts or
Um,
something.
so so human decision making requires things to have natures and to function according to those natures.
Right,
And all we're saying here in terms of scientific methodology is that as scientists, because there are plenty of scientists who are believers, but as scientists doing science, they're looking for natural causes for natural phenomena. And all
right,
this is a precise, typically mathematically based investigation into the secondary causes uh, which have God as their cause,
right.
right?
And
We're
that
not
really,
investing. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, that really tees us up. That really, frames it extremely well for, I think, the question of evolution.
Yeah.
And so, Darwin goes on this trip. He goes to the Galapagos. Uh, this what he understood about genetics and biology and
Hmm.
all of those matters is radically different than what's understood today.
Yeah.
But this question, I just think it's remarkable that we can segue into this like this. This question of Darwin coming up with this evolutionary theory
Hmm.
and Darwin, observing, this these animals there on the Galapagos and having this anyway, this maybe this idea in his mind there on his voyage, this question of the theory of evolution.
Hmm.
And so, in light of this discussion, and I know this is kind of a melting pot of a question. In light of this discussion of God being, an ultimate or primary cause, nature having secondary causes,
Hmm.
can you explain what is the theory of evolution? And in that, we have this response by some, well, it's just a theory, which is a misunderstanding of what that
Hmm.
means. But then we have this evolution, this common ancestry, and this gradual change over time, resulting in an extreme diversity of maybe even plant life, but certainly
Yeah.
animal life. And even if you can maybe have the aroma of this ultimate and secondary causation, and maybe even how that plays into, because there would theistic evolutionists tend to try to gravitate more toward an ultimate explanation, but invoking almost like secondary explanation mechanisms, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so maybe just that's I know that's a lot maybe to digest, but I know you're up to the challenge.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Digestible, yes. Explicable,
Right.
maybe not. So let me go back and
Please.
so I'm gonna after this historical summary, I'll pivot to not primary and secondary causes, but substantial and accidental,
Okay.
because I think that'll get us nearer to our goal. Um, and then we'll explain what those are.
Right.
So uh, I think Darwin, I think because of the role that Darwinism has played largely in the humanities, in philosophy and psychology, and then in the broader culture, John West does some work to show how Darwinian philosophy gave rise to like the eugenics movement, and
Right.
then ultimately people like Adolf Hitler and his anti-Semitism, right? But it doesn't start there. It starts as a theory in biology. Now, uh, as a historical backdrop, probably the dominant biology textbook leading up to, say, the 1820s, 1830s, when Darwin is uh, making his trip on the Beagle and going to the Galapagos and developing his theory, was William Paley's natural theology. And this is where
Hmm.
we get the if I pitched my foot against
Right.
a stone, for all I know, the stone may have lain there for forever. But if I found a watch, I would notice that the precision and interconnectivity of the parts requires, or it requires a designer, right? So this is the Paley's watchmaker argument. So what Darwin what so that we'll call this the received view. That's a typical term in the sciences, but I'll use it specifically here. Um, what the view that Darwin receives is that the creation of the world, the create animals, basically, we're at a stage in the early 1800s, right, where we're really just new species are being discovered, that their taxonomy is being worked out among biologists in plants, insect, animal world. And so this is the time where uh, real real what we might call international travel was just emerging. I mean, to travel from one continent to another was a pretty spectacular thing in the
Hmm.
day. Okay, so the received view from William Paley's natural theology was largely a few things that everything, every animal species was created by God for a particular environment several thousand years ago, right? That was the received view. Basically, a very conservative young earth creationist view that when we look at, say, the flora and fauna on the Galapagos Islands, and then we look at the flora and fauna on like the Cape de Verde Islands just off of Africa. I think that's right. Um, they have similar environments, but they have completely different plants and animals living there, right? They're similar uh, tropical island environments, but they have completely different animals living there. So what Darwin received and couldn't figure out is that if God thought that the Galapagos Islands were the perfect environment for the Galapagos kinds of plants and animals, why, when we look at the Cape de Verde Islands that basically have the same climate and whatever, they're completely different species there? Not only that, but the species on the Galapagos look are much more related to the nearest mainland. The same with the Cape de Verde Islands and Africa. The plants and animals that we find there are much more closely related to the animals in their nearest continent. And so there were these questions that William Paley's natural theology just didn't give good answers for. Why, if God created these specific plants and animals for this specific environment, why, when the environment is nearly identical, does he create completely different plants and animals? And why are those plants and animals more related to the nearest mainland than they are to each other, right? So, so that's one of the things that's in the back of Darwin's mind. The other thing that happens in the 1830s is that a guy named Charles Lyell writes a three-volume series on geology, right? And he and Lyell adopts a kind of gradualism as opposed to a catastrophism. So, so for somebody who's a catastrophist, how are canyons made? Well, Noah's flood. Some catastrophic event happened, and in some short period of time, now you have a canyon. Well, Charles Lyell said, well, if we if there's a river running through a valley and it's running through that valley for say 150 million years, it can do that work gradually over long periods of time. He thought maybe 300 million years. And then you have a canyon, you have a canyon formed not by some catastrophic sudden event, but by something that is very slow and gradual over a long geologic period of time. So Darwin takes that assumption from Charles Lyell, this not 6,000 years. and not the necessity of design, but the possibility that nature did some of this stuff itself, that small changes over geologic time can lead up to large changes. So you can see how he takes these assumptions from a geological context and he places them in a biological or paleontological context. Combine that with his experience as a pigeon breeder and his association um, with artificial selection. So breeders can, dog breeders do this. They choose uh, they're not species. What are they? Breeds. They choose breeds that have certain features: long ears, short tails, long legs, short fur, right? And they crossbreed them until they get a breed that, like my mother-in-law has was it a snickerdoodle it's not a snickerdoodle. What's it called?
Uh, Not a labradoodle.
That might be it. Um, it's something like that. It's a
Right.
cross
It's a
between
right.
poodle and Labrador,
It's
right?
like a large dog that looks kind of like a poodle's fur.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Go. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Right. So, um, so uh, Darwin is trying to resolve some of these unresolved issues that arise from William Paley. He's borrowing from Charles Lyell's geological view
Right.
and saying, yeah, I think if we take what we understand from artificial breeding selection and we add to it small changes over geologic time, adding up to large changes, we can see how uh, relatively primitive species could transform into more complex developed species given a long enough timeline. Now, you also mentioned that Darwin has no idea about genetics because Mendelian genetics happens in
Right.
like the 1920s, 1930s, right? But so Darwin just called these things uh, uh, principles of variation within
Hmm.
a kind. He didn't understand genetic mutation or anything like that. So he just called them principles of variation within a kind or something like that. And so yeah, that's sort of the project that Darwin is working on, and the problem set that he's trying to solve for, and some of the assumptions that go into that. Now, when we get to the 1940s and we post the genetic revolution, we start understanding that the smallest unit in biology is not a single cell, but rather that the cell itself is composed of, organelles and, DNA and genes and things like that. Um, then we think that they think, okay, we found the biological basis for Darwin's vague principles of variation, and we do see that um, some aberrant traits are born out of these genetic mutations. And so if these mutations sort of accidentally hit on um, a an advance in survival and breeding and things like that, then they would have been selected for not artificially but naturally. So now we have the idea of nature selecting naturally in the same way that breeders do artificially, and that's where we get neo-Darwinism. We take the general approach of Darwin to the history of life, and we add the neo in neo-Darwinism is the addition of genetics
Right.
from, and then we have the neo-Darwinian revolution with George Gaylord Simpson and Theodosius Dobzhansky and people like that in the 1940s.
I hope this content has brought incredible value to you. Again, if you feel it has brought value to you, please subscribe to this podcast, like or follow our social media accounts and posts, share this with your friends and family. Please be sure also to visit TimotheusAcademy.com for links to more content. And as always, I hope to see you again soon at Timotheus Academy.